Welcome to Mind Shield. We protect the mind and pursue the truth. Let's get started.
Good evening. This is not a speculative lecture about abstract ethics. This is a briefing on choice, consequence, and the moment when silence stops being passive and becomes participation. The reason this message exists is simple. Systems of covert abuse survive on invisibility, compartmentalization, and the comforting lie that no one person is responsible. But that is not how history works, and it is not how law works. Harm does not become lawful because it is technical. Intrusion does not become moral because it is deniable. When a person is surveilled, destabilized, isolated, or psychologically pressured through hidden means, the machinery may be modern, but the crime is ancient. So this opening slide is a line in the sand. If you know something, then this is not just another day. This is your window. Most people do not stay in abusive systems because the abusers are cartoon villains. They stay because they are trapped by pressure. Fear and intimidation tell them the network is too powerful to challenge. Financial and career pressure whispers that contracts, clearances, and reputations matter more than conscience. Obedience and group loyalty make wrongdoing feel normal inside a closed culture. And denial plus blackmail finish the job by teaching people to call invisible harm unreal. This is how ordinary people get turned into moving parts. Psychology has always been the lubricant of organized abuse. The first prison is not the lock on the door. It is the story people tell themselves so they can sleep at night. That is why this slide matters. It says, yes, the pressure is real, but pressure is not innocence. Engineered silence is still silence, and silence still protects the people inflicting harm. One of the oldest tricks in the book is to confuse invisibility with impossibility. If a method is hard to see, people start thinking it leaves no trace. That is fantasy. Every operation expands its trail as soon as more than one person is involved. Operators talk. Lookouts text. Contractors invoice. Devices are associated with routers. Vehicles pass cameras. Hardware gets purchased. Networks leave timing patterns. Money moves. The glamour of covert technology often blinds people to the stupidity of human behavior. Complex wrongdoing still depends on very simple mistakes. And then there is the first to talk rule. The person who comes forward early has the best shot at being treated as a witness rather than as a loyal cog in a criminal machine. That is not poetry. That is a survival strategy. Participation does not vanish because transmission is wireless. Digital smoke still means there was a fire. This slide does something important. It pulls the conversation out of the realm of mystique and back into engineering. The illusion says silent voices, untraceable frequency, ghost operation. The forensic reality is that if a system interacts with the world, it has constraints. Energy has to come from somewhere. Timing has to exist. Equipment has to be placed. Signals have to behave according to physics, not mythology. If radio frequency methods are involved, then spectrum behavior, burst patterns, and hardware footprints become relevant. If networked coordination is involved, then logs, leases, access records, and device associations matter. If there were a physical deployment, there would be routes, purchases, mounts, batteries, vehicles, and operators. In other words, the field may feel uncanny to the victim, but the evidence trail is usually painfully ordinary. The trick is not to chase the whole exotic theory at once. The trick is to identify one measurable thread and pull until the whole sweater comes apart. This slide reframes the problem in constitutional language. Because once private intrusion moves beyond rumor and into action, the questions are no longer philosophical. They are legal. Privacy and unlawful search live in Fourth Amendment territory. Speech suppression, intimidation, retaliation, and coercive isolation touch the first. Deprivation of liberty, bodily interference, and punishment without process crash into the Fifth and 14th. And where suffering is prolonged, coercive, and deliberately inflicted, the Eighth Amendment enters the room as a moral thunderhead, even when the fact pattern is unconventional. The core point is this: constitutions were written to restrain power when power gets clever. They were not designed only for visible boots and obvious handcuffs. They also exist for hidden intrusion, disguised punishment, and systems that try to wound without leaving a clean fingerprint. A republic dies by loophole when citizens start treating technical workarounds as permission slips. International law exists because states and institutions have a terrible habit of renaming cruelty until it sounds administrative. Experiment, procedure, program, countermeasure, behavioral management. All these phrases can become makeup on a corpse. This slide argues that when non-consensual intrusion and sustained psychological or neurological assault are inflicted on a human being, especially outside due process and without consent, the old moral categories return with teeth. Torture does not need a medieval dungeon. It only needs intent, suffering, power imbalance, and denial of personhood. The Nuremberg lesson was never only about the past. It was a warning to the future. Science without consent becomes predation. Bureaucracy without accountability becomes a weapon. Technology does not modernize ethics. It tests them. And if there is one thread that should make every participant nervous, it is this one. History has a brutal way of dragging innovators back into the plain language of abuse. Now the debt comes down from the high clouds and lands on the statues. That is where people start sweating. Because abstract wrongdoing can be rationalized, but criminal exposure is arithmetic. Unauthorized access to devices, networks, accounts, or protected records can trigger computer crime and privacy statutes. Intercepting communications brings wiretap exposure. Sustained harassment that causes substantial emotional distress enters cyberstalking territory. Multi-person coordination opens the door to conspiracy, racketeering theories, aiding and abetting, and obstruction if evidence is altered or destroyed. Unauthorized transmission or interference with regulated spectrum can invite communications enforcement action. The point is not that every case produces every charge. The point is that operations like this create legal attack surfaces in every direction. Once investigators find one credible artifact, they do not need to prove the whole mythology on day one. They only need enough conventional evidence to justify subpoenas, warrants, and escalation. Then the system starts talking. Criminal exposure is only half the storm. Civil exposure is where many participants get financially flayed alive. States often provide broad avenues for invasion of privacy, intentional infliction of emotional distress, stalking, trespass, assault-related claims, and conspiracy-based liability. And the civil court has a lower burden than the criminal court. That matters. You do not need a prosecutor's perfect theory for a defendant's life to be torn open. You need credible facts, records, patterns, and enough connective tissue for a jury to see intent or reckless disregard. State-level statutes can also be more explicit about harmful device misuse or harassment conduct than people assume. This is where the fantasy of deniable tech collapses into mortgage language. Bank accounts, insurance exposure, employability, discovery requests, sworn depositions, public filings, device imaging, and reputational collapse. Criminal court threatens freedom. Civil court threatens the architecture of an ordinary life. For many people, that is the scarier blade. A system like this survives because each participant clings to a tiny fragment of the machine and says, "That part wasn't mine." But law and morality both hate that trick. The operator says, "I only ran the equipment." The lookout says, "I only watched the perimeter." The funder says, "I never touched the target." The data broker or private investigator says, "I only sourced information." Tech support says, "I only kept the infrastructure running." But harm is a chain, not a single hand. The person who spots the target, the person who pays, the person who acquires the hardware, the person who cleans the logs, the person who routes the traffic, and the person who pretends not to see any of it are not orbiting innocence. They are stabilizing the offense. This slide matters because it breaks the dream of moral outsourcing. Liability extends across the network. Every touchpoint can become an indictment. This is the slide that should make the stomach drop. I'm protected by my contractor status. It was classified. I signed an NDA. I'm just a technician. Those are not defenses. They are bedtime stories told by frightened adults. NDAs do not erase felonies. Corporate structure does not baptize wrongdoing. National security language does not give civilians or contractors a magic tunnel under domestic law. And technical specialization is not moral innocence. In fact, the more specialized the role, the easier it is to prove knowledge, intent, and capability. History is merciless on this point. Every abusive structure eventually leaves its foot soldiers standing in court without the grand machine they thought would shield them. The institution protects itself first. Always. When exposure comes, the narrative changes overnight. The same system that once rewarded silence begins shedding bodies like a snake shedding skin. And the technician learns, too late, that the courtroom speaks plain English. This is one of the strongest slides in the whole deck because it understands how real investigations work. Cases do not usually begin with the full theory. They begin with one thing: one router lease, one strange SDR recording, one work order, one purchase order that makes no sense, one vehicle plate, one leaked chat log, one device that should not have been there, one billing pattern that leads to a contractor, which leads to a company, which leads to a supervisor, which leads to preserved communications and search warrants. That is how the line from suspicion to probable cause, and from probable cause to process, is drawn. Investigators do not need the victim to decode every exotic mechanism in perfect detail. They need one conventional artifact strong enough to start unraveling the conspiracy from the edges inward. In complex cases, the thread is often boring. That is exactly why it works. Boring evidence survives cross-examination. Now we move from warning to method. If you are a witness, a participant with a conscience, or someone adjacent to the operation, your first duty is preservation. Save emails, chat logs, access records, payment records, schedules, tickets, work orders, screenshots, and backups. Print hard copies. Record dates, times, locations, placements, vehicles, and recurring names. Freeze the hardware. Do not wipe phones. Do not reconfigure routers. Do not delete cloud drives. Do not clean up anything in a panic, because panic has sent many people sprinting directly into obstruction territory. Chain of custody matters. A preserved mess is better than a polished lie. Think like an archivist, not a fixer. Evidence is fragile in the first hours and most valuable, before the machine realizes someone is stepping out of line. The cleanest act of courage is often not a speech. It is a backup drive, labeled carefully, stored safely, waiting for the right hands. Truth should never travel through only one gatekeeper. That is the strategic point of this slide. Tier 1 is direct reporting to federal and state authorities with jurisdiction over cyber, civil rights, stalking, privacy, and organized abuse. Tier 2 moves into oversight bodies and regulators, where unauthorized transmissions, contractor abuse, procurement irregularities, or agency misconduct can be documented. Tier 3 goes broader. Specialized attorneys, investigative journalists, and human rights organizations capable of creating public pressure when institutions try to bury the matter locally. Redundancy is safety. That sentence should ring a bell. When the facts are dangerous, single-channel reporting is fragile. Multi-channel reporting makes suppression harder. It creates witnesses to the witness. It also changes the psychology of the offender network. Once people know the evidence has spread beyond a single office, fear shifts from the victim to the perpetrators. And that reversal is the beginning of leverage. This is the fork in the road slide, and it is morally sharp. Path A is continued complicity. More tasks, more logs, more payments, more digital residue, more lies, more exposure, more ruin. Path B is uglier in the short term, but cleaner in the long term. Come forward, preserve evidence, cooperate, and reposition yourself from a silent participant to a witness. No one should pretend that stepping out is painless. It is not. Systems built on secrecy punish defectors first. But every day, inside the operation, both legal exposure and spiritual corrosion increase. That is the quiet horror of compartmentalized abuse. It makes ordinary people perform small tasks until they wake up and realize they have become custodians of someone else's suffering. This slide says there is still time. Not forever, not without cost, but now. Right now, before history hardens around your name in the wrong column. And here is the closing. Stop. Not next week. Not after one more task. Not after one more favor for one more superior who will not stand beside you when this breaks. Stop now. If you witnessed it, document it. If you know where evidence lives, preserve it. If some part of you is still human beneath the scripts, the compartmentalization, the fear, the thrill, or the paycheck, then act before somebody is maimed, silenced, or buried under the weight of a cover story. Cover-ups are not neutral acts. They extend the harm's life. Every erased record, every coached narrative, every delayed disclosure is another hand on the victim's throat. This presentation is not asking for perfection. It is asking for a decision. The machine runs on compliance. Break compliance, and the machine begins to starve.